Ever assume type O is just the plain one? The default? Think again. What's buried in ancient DNA suggests your ancestors weren't merely getting by. They were locked in a genetic arms race against some of history's most brutal diseases. For years, doctors treated O as the unremarkable blood type. No complications, no backstory, just the universal donor waiting quietly on a shelf in every blood bank. Then researchers started combing through ancient genomes and stumbled onto something nobody was expecting. Across parts of the Americas, indigenous populations don't just tend toward type O, they're saturated with it. Not 60%, not 80%. In certain tribes, the figure climbs above 99%. That's not luck. That's not statistical noise built up over millennia. That's a signature, evidence that something happened to an entire people, etched permanently into their bloodstream. So what actually caused this? Why would a single blood type dominate an entire continent while everywhere else stayed blended? The explanation weaves through epidemics, ice age journeys, oceans nobody believed were crossable, and a debate scientists still haven't settled. And it begins with a puzzle nobody saw coming. Keep watching, because by the time we're done, you'll see why type O might be the most consequential blood type in human history. Let's start with what most people already believe they understand. Human blood breaks down into 4 core types: A, B, AB, and O. What separates them are microscopic markers called antigens, sitting on the surface of red blood cells. Think of them as ID tags. Type A carries the A tag. Type B carries the B tag. AB carries both. Type O carries nothing, completely blank. That blankness is precisely why O earned its reputation as the universal donor. With no A or B marker present, the immune system has nothing to attack, meaning O blood can be given to almost anyone without triggering a dangerous reaction. When there's no time to run a blood test in an emergency room, doctors default to O negative, the safest option when every second counts. For most of the last century, that was the whole story. O is handy, O is widespread, O is simple, end of discussion. Except O was never meant to be the default. Geneticists now believe type O arose from a mutation, a piece of genetic code that was deleted from the gene responsible for building A and B antigens in the first place. In other words, O isn't the original blood type at all. It's the glitch, the accident. And yet that glitch didn't just hang on. In huge swaths of the world, it became dominant. Globally, type O is now the single most common blood type, present in nearly half of all people on Earth. That's already odd for something that started life as a deletion. But it gets odder still. Look at certain indigenous communities across the Americas, and the number doesn't sit anywhere near half. It climbs to 90%, then 95%, and in some tribes edges close to a full 100%. An entire population, almost uniformly carrying a blood type that began as a mistake. That's not a footnote in human genetics. That's a signal. And once scientists began asking why one continent looks so radically different from the rest, they uncovered something most people have never even heard of. So why does one continent break the pattern so completely? To understand that, you need to step back and look at how blood types are distributed worldwide. In Africa, where human life is believed to have originated, type O appears at high frequency, part of why some researchers think it may be among the oldest variants still in circulation. As people migrated into Europe and Asia, the balance shifted. Type A grew common through Western Europe. Type B surged across Central and East Asia. The tidy 4-letter system began fragmenting unevenly by continent, sculpted by thousands of years of movement, disease, and isolation. Then there's the Americas, and here the pattern breaks entirely. Rather than a blend like you'd find in Europe or Asia, indigenous populations show an overwhelming, near-uniform presence of type O, with some communities reaching frequencies geneticists almost never see anywhere else on the planet. The dominant explanation reaches back to the last ice age, when small bands of early humans crossed a land bridge linking Siberia to Alaska. These founding groups were tiny, and it's likely many already carried type O. When a small population seeds an entire lineage, whatever traits that founding group happens to carry get amplified across every generation that follows, until it defines the whole population. That's part of the answer. But there's a second factor. Once those early arrivals settled across the Americas, the continent became cut off. Two oceans on either side meant essentially no new genetic material arrived for thousands of years. No incoming blood types to dilute the pool. No outside populations mixing in to rebalance things. Type O simply had no rival. It embedded itself deeper with each generation until it came to define entire nations. Compare that with other isolated populations elsewhere. Certain Pacific Island groups show similarly skewed blood type distributions for the same reason. Isolation locking in whatever genetic hand the founders happen to be dealt. But nowhere does the pattern run as deep or as consistent as it does across the Americas. Numbers like that don't appear by accident, so researchers went looking for confirmation, and decades of work have backed it up repeatedly. Study after study of Native American populations across many communities has turned up something nearly unbelievable. In some groups, close to 99% of participants tested as type O, not a majority, not a strong trend. Nearly everyone, long before anyone could even sequence a genome properly. And it wasn't confined to one region. The same numbers surfaced everywhere researchers looked, from indigenous communities in the far north of Canada down to groups deep in the Amazon. Different climates, different diets, different languages, entirely different environments, and yet the same blood type winning out again and again. What was actually going on? The leading explanation is natural selection doing exactly what it's built to do over thousands of years. The early populations that crossed into the Americas faced harsh conditions, brutal climates, unfamiliar pathogens, and constant physical strain just to survive long enough to reproduce. In circumstances like that, even a marginal biological edge can compound. If type O offered even a slight advantage against the infections circulating at the time, those who carried it were more likely to survive, more likely to have children, and more likely to pass that same trait forward. Repeat that across hundreds of generations, and a once random genetic quirk stops looking random. It starts looking inevitable. This is the part most people miss when they hear that type O is common. Common doesn't mean unremarkable. Across the Americas, common means selected. Chosen, generation after generation, by forces the people carrying it never knew existed. Their bodies were quietly winning battles they were never aware of, and the survivors carried the proof forward in their blood. Modern DNA analysis has only reinforced what decades of blood typing first suggested. This wasn't random drift. It wasn't coincidence. It was survival, written directly into the genetic code of an entire continent, one generation at a time. But the pressures weren't identical everywhere, and that's where the story sharpens. Consider the Andes, where certain indigenous populations have lived at extreme altitude for thousands of years, breathing air with a fraction of the oxygen available at sea level. Their bodies adapted in striking ways over time, and researchers noticed something intriguing sitting beneath those adaptations: a notably high rate of type O among high-altitude communities. It's a contested idea, but here's the theory. Some scientists suggest type O blood may move somewhat more freely through narrow blood vessels, potentially assisting oxygen delivery to tissue, though this isn't broadly accepted in mainstream hematology and remains unproven. At sea level, the difference would be negligible. At 12,000 feet, proponents argue it could matter more. It's a small, speculative biological wrinkle with a possible payoff in precisely the environment where these communities settled. Then there's disease. Historical evidence suggests people carrying A or B antigens were hit harder by certain infections, because some pathogens are essentially built to latch onto those exact markers, like a key made for a specific lock. Type O, carrying neither, doesn't offer that same entry point. Malaria wasn't a dominant threat in the pre-Columbian Americas the way it was in Africa, but the underlying principle still holds. Fewer molecular targets for pathogens means fewer pathways for disease to spread through a population. Diet adds another, shakier layer. Indigenous communities ate vastly different foods depending on location: seafood-heavy diets along the Pacific coast, corn-based diets across Mesoamerica. Some have speculated that type O metabolism might process high-protein, high-fat diets differently, an idea that echoes the popular blood-type diet, one most nutrition scientists consider unsupported by evidence. And then there's the social dimension, easy to overlook but hard to dismiss. In small, tightly knit communities, someone whose blood could be given to nearly anyone during childbirth or after injury wasn't just fortunate, they were valuable. That kind of value doesn't only save lives in the moment. Over generations, it can quietly influence who survives, who thrives, and whose lineage continues. Before we get to the next part, if you've ever looked at your own results and wondered how this ancient bloodline fits into your family history, I've laid it all out in a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? Links in the description. But stick around, because what's coming next is the part most people completely overlook. If the fossil record and early blood testing sketch the outline of this story, modern DNA technology is what's filling in the details. Over the past 20 years, genetic testing has become precise enough to trace lineages back through specific tribes, specific regions, even specific historical figures, something that would have sounded like science fiction not long ago. One striking example involves a direct descendant of Sitting Bull. Through DNA testing, researchers confirmed a genetic link tying a living relative directly to one of the most significant figures in Native American history, closing a gap that oral history alone had never been able to fully verify. For descendants of indigenous peoples, a confirmation like this carries weight far beyond simple curiosity. For generations, colonization disrupted records, fractured families, and in many cases deliberately cut people off from their tribal histories. DNA testing has become one of the few tools capable of reconnecting some of those severed threads, a path back to ancestors, languages, and communities that history tried to erase. It's not purely symbolic either. For many indigenous people, proving ancestry through DNA can affect access to tribal recognition, resources, and rights tied to heritage. A genetic test in these cases isn't a novelty purchase. It can determine whether someone is formally recognized as part of a community or excluded from it entirely. But this power carries real tension. The same genetic data that reconnects people with their roots can also be bought, sold, and stored by private companies pursuing their own commercial interests. Questions of consent, privacy, and who ultimately controls this information remain some of the most contested issues in the field. Treating someone's genetic heritage as a product to be packaged and sold sits uneasily against its deeper purpose, helping people understand who they are and where they came from. Scientists in this space increasingly argue that, done responsibly, with indigenous communities directing how their own data is used, this technology can become something rare, a tool that heals historical wounds rather than deepening them. Some DNA results don't just fill in a family tree, they ignite real debate about what scientists thought they understood about an entire continent. That's what happened with a man named Crawford, living on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, one of the largest Native American reservations in the country. When a commercial DNA company analyzed his ancestry, the results went well beyond a standard family history report. Worth noting, this wasn't a peer-reviewed academic study. The company's findings pointed to an unusually deep genetic timeline, a claim that remains disputed among archaeologists and hasn't been validated by mainstream research. For decades, the standard theory was straightforward. Small groups crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, then spread southward over generations. If results like Crawford's hold up under further scrutiny, they could complicate that timeline, adding weight to a growing argument among some researchers that the real story may be older, messier, and less linear than the textbook version suggests. And the deeper scientists dig into ancient genomes, the stranger the picture becomes. Take Neanderthals and Denisovans, two ancient human groups long written off as primitive evolutionary dead ends. Genetic analysis tells a very different story. Both groups share enough in common with modern humans that some researchers argue they should be treated as close relatives rather than inferior separate species. So, archaeological evidence supports this too, revealing sophisticated tool-making, artistic expression, and even symbolic behavior among Neanderthals, capabilities once thought unique to modern humans. Here's the detail that changes everything. Many people alive today carry traces of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, proof these groups didn't simply disappear. They interbred, blended, and left fingerprints still visible in human genetics tens of thousands of years later. Then there's Lake Baikal in Siberia. the oldest and deepest freshwater lake on Earth, sitting at the heart of an ancient migration story most people have never heard of. For thousands of years, this single location functioned as a genetic crossroads where populations from east and west met, mingled, and exchanged DNA long before any of it was written down. Some researchers believe the ancestors of Native Americans passed directly through this region on their way toward a continent no human had ever set foot on. But perhaps the strangest discovery of all is proof that indigenous Americans had contact with people from across the open Pacific, centuries before Europeans ever arrived. Genetic evidence indicates Polynesians and Native Americans interacted roughly 800 years ago, an encounter that left clear traces still detectable in DNA today. This isn't a minor claim. It means someone, somewhere, crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and encountered people who had no idea they were coming. The clues had actually been hiding in plain sight for a long time. Sweet potatoes and bottle gourds, crops native to the Americas, turning up in Polynesian archaeological sites with no other clear explanation. For years, that evidence fueled fierce debate, with many scientists dismissing it as coincidence or contamination. But newer genetic studies shifted the conversation. Researchers identified shared DNA segments across multiple Polynesian islands, all tracing back to the same indigenous American source. Evidence of genuine intermixing, not chance. Using computational methods, scientists even traced that ancestry to a specific region in what is now Colombia. Which raises a bigger, still unresolved question. How did people actually first reach the Americas? The land bridge theory remains the leading explanation, but it's far from the only one under consideration. Some researchers argue for a coastal route, following the shoreline by boat rather than trekking overland. Others raise the possibility of travel across polar ice, and many indigenous nations, including the Navajo, hold their own origin traditions, accounts describing peoples who were always present on this land, not arrivals from elsewhere. Science hasn't settled that question, and it may never fully agree on a single answer. What science has settled is this: type O blood isn't a side note in any of these stories. It's tied to migrations across oceans, survival through plagues, adaptation to extreme altitude, and connections between continents nobody expected to find linked at all. And it's still doing exactly what it's always done. Right now, in hospitals everywhere, type O blood is being transfused into patients who have no idea their blood carries the imprint of every twist in this story. So the next time someone calls type O the simple, unremarkable blood type, you'll know better. It isn't blank, it isn't boring. It's a record written in molecules instead of words, of ice age crossings, plagues endured, mountains adapted to, and oceans somehow crossed by people history nearly forgot to mention. For millions of indigenous people across the Americas, that record isn't abstract. It's running through their veins right now, the same way it ran through the veins of ancestors who endured conditions most of us can scarcely imagine. Science still doesn't have every answer. How exactly humans first reached this continent? Why type O won out so completely? What really happened on those Pacific shores 8 centuries ago? These questions are still being debated in labs and journals today. But one thing isn't up for debate. This blood type carried people through history's hardest moments, and it's still quietly doing the same job in hospitals right now, long after most people forgot why it ever mattered. If you're type O, you're not carrying a footnote. You're carrying a survival story centuries in the making. Which part of this surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments.